Welcome, everyone. This is a continuation of my lecture series for Module 6 on human migration. We're going to begin by talking about internal migration, but before we get to that, I just want to do a general overview. Migration has been a part of the human experience forever, ever since we've been around. And you can see by this map how humans really came out of Africa and then diffused to the rest of the planet, given these time periods here. This is to the best of our knowledge so far. We have learned many things in the last 20 years that verify this story, but also add to it. One of the surprising things that we've learned is that in the prehistoric era, going back tens of thousands of years ago, there was extensive human migration. That is, that we originally had thought most humans were local clans and local areas, but they migrated quite extensively and interacted with each other across thousands of miles. One of the things that happened with the advent of agriculture, a lot of that migration became more sedentary. Groups began to settle down, eventually led into the advent of history and the world we have today. But all through that period, as we have cycles where migration really takes off, and we're in one of those cycles right now. With the advent of modernity, migration really began to change around the world. Colonialism really added to that. There's a long story there that has led to where we are today. The other interesting thing is that we are talking a lot about climate change today and how that's affecting migration patterns, but that's always been the case. Humans have responded to natural climate change and also human-made climate change on a regional scale throughout our whole history. There's many examples of climate factors altering where people lived, forcing people to move or encouraging people to move to other places. Some of that is from natural forces. Some of that is from human activity, like deforesting an area, causing drought, forcing human populations in that area to move. This is, again, an ongoing story. What we're seeing today is an expression of that, but at a much grander scale, because now it's happening at a global level, everywhere at once. And the migration that we're seeing today, accelerated by climate change, is a consequence of human activity in combination with natural systems reacting to that human activity and then augmenting the climate change. One of the great cases of it is what happened with the Americas. Humans migrated to the Americas tens of thousands of years ago. The exact time is uncertain. There's a lot of still controversy about it. Some people will go as far back as 100,000 years, but typically in North American scholarship, we're thinking somewhere around 20,000 years ago, 25,000 years ago. There's solid evidence now for human migration, both coming from the Asian bridge here that during a time of the Ice Age, the sea level was much lower, so people could walk across from Siberia into Alaska. And also there's evidence too that suggests that pre-Polynesian people from the South Pacific here actually did take boats over to South America. And there's some evidence that suggesting that happened 20,000 years ago. So it's a long story. More recent times, we have the Age of Empires with the European colonization, Age of Exploration that happened and really transformed the world, brought people from one part of the world to another in a way that had never happened before as quickly because of technologies, of shipping technology, and because of political dimensions of conquest and colonization. And that led to the modern world. One of the big stories there is the slave trade. Slavery has been around for thousands upon thousands of years. It's not a new development. There are stories in Mesopotamia going back several thousand years ago about slavery. What is different about the slave trade in the last centuries is how it linked to political and economic transformations associated with the age of exploration and European global conquest. So it accelerated and magnified to a much greater degree what we ever seen before. So you can see by this map how many humans were transported from Africa to the Americas in particular. And another big advent in human history, which we talked about a little bit last module, is the Columbian Exchange and how that brought over European and Asian diseases to the New World and transformed the New World by eradicating most of the populations there and then them being replaced by populations from the Old World. And again, there's a long history of oppression, brutalization, ethnic cleansing, even genocidal activities that went along with all of this. Trail of Tears is a monument to forced march of indigenous tribes from the Appalachian region to, I think they settled in Oklahoma ultimately. And so in this forced march of thousands of families, many died, many suffered, and you can read about it on your own. Just one example of thousands of cases where this whole transition really was quite brutal for the Americas. One of the things we need to talk about is that there is a difference with frontier nations and migration. There are many countries in the world that were born out of the colonial movement, like the United States, Canada, Australia, many in South America, that were frontier nations. That is, the Europeans migrated into countries with extensive borders, characterized by diverse populations that created varying levels of economic development across those countries. So you can see in the United States, you had the East Coast, Boston versus like Oklahoma City, which was quite different at the same period of time. So you started with this frontier idea really does make a big difference. It is expressed through a very different cultural diversity. Migration has influenced ultimately the identity of those nations, the social cohesions of those nations, and the culture and the cultural interchanges of those nations. If you think about the United States and some of the issues that we're going through with our own identity, our own sense of social justice and things like racism and indigenous rights, all of that, it really arises out of this history of the United States being a frontier nation. What we've done is moved westward over time. That is, as the Americas were largely empty of people by the time the Europeans got here, that is, the British got here, I should say, there was a lot of room for expansion. It was easy for the European settlers to move westward and take land from the remaining indigenous people who lived there. And that's what happened. And so we moved westward and we moved southward for the last few hundred years, as you can see by this map. Today, the migration flow is a little more diverse than that. We're still having a general westward migration and southward migration, but there are also other dynamics happening as well. For example, now there are people moving out of the west to the south in larger numbers than before. So there's sort of a backflow happening as well, while at the same time, places like the Great Plains and the Midwest are still depopulating. The Northeast is relatively stable at this point. We lost a lot of people in the transition from the industrial area to the post-industrial era, and how millions of jobs dried up in the Northeast and moved to other places. And so there was a big loss for a while, but now we've stabilized in this part of the country. And so the outflow and the inflow are not all that different. If you go into a more micro scale, you can see by county here in the United States how you have many countries that are experiencing large swaths of outmigration and many counties that are experiencing large swaths of immigration. One interesting place to look at, this is a timestamp, 2007, 2008. It was the beginning of an oil boom in North Dakota. You can see that this part of North Dakota is really growing like crazy. But with fossil fuels, there are cycles, boom and bust cycles. You would not see that big pattern of red if you were to look there today. You probably would see blue instead, because that cycle came and went. And so now people have moved out and the jobs have disappeared along with them. Basically, we can look at migration in different ways. It generally means a change of residence. Very straightforward. A migrant is a person moving essentially from one place to another. Migration is the collective phenomena, that is the number of movements that are happening. You can measure this mathematically and statistically. People could move residentially, just within a city or a suburban area. We could move internally within a country, which is called internal migration, say one state to another. Or we can cross borders, which is immigration. As soon as you go from one country to another, you add the IM to migration. Emigration, which is EM, simply means people leaving a country. IM, immigration, means people coming into a country. If you look at Mexico, for example, it's experiencing all three. You've got interregional migration going from one province to another, as you can see here by these red lines. You have intra-regional migration, let's say people moving from one suburb of Mexico City to another. And then you have people leaving the country. That is emigration. People are emigrating from Mexico to the United States. And then immigration, people coming from Central America into Mexico. Look at China, you start to see specifically interregional migration is a lot of people moving to the southeast coast, as this area has been developing exceedingly rapidly in the last few generations, although it's beginning to slow down now. So people have been leaving the areas where there's less economic activity and going into areas with much more economic activity. Brazil, interestingly enough, is trying to exploit and develop the Amazon. So you can see here how there's a lot of movement of people entering the Amazon and living there for that reason. Great deal of poverty in this country. And so when there's opportunities for people to actually make a better life for themselves within Brazil, they will take it. Of course, this has all kinds of environmental implications that we can talk about later. Now, there are time considerations here. There are people who move seasonally and temporarily, seasonal workers, for example, students. And then there are people who move permanently, who intend to stay for an extended period of time. How do we measure all that? There's problems with measuring it. If you do the US Census and you're measuring it at, say, 5-year intervals, you're going to miss a lot between the 5 years, because the census is only measuring people are at one point in time versus where they are at another point in time. Someone could have moved 3 or 4 times in 5 years, or have moved out and just moved right back in and not been noticed. So it misses a lot. The American Community Survey is a 1-year interval, which is a little bit better. However, it still has problems measuring a lot of reasons why people move. They've been sort of developing the questions there, improving the questions to try to get at that. But there's a qualitative aspect to migration which is very difficult to get at if you're just looking at the raw numbers. What we're seeing is that interstate migration has been declining. New Hampshire is an example of that in red, and Massachusetts as well. You can see that the difference in average annual rates of interstate migration during the 80s and 2000s in this chart. In general, what's been happening is that in America, people have been moving a lot less over time. We really maxed out in the 50s and 60s, started to slow down in the 70s, a brief uptake in the 80s, and then it's been downhill ever since. So people are less mobile than they were. Significantly less, almost twice as many people were moving in earlier generations as they are now. Mobility is generally associated with economic growth and development, and the United States was growing quite rapidly and is in its heyday of economic power back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And since then, we have been declining. Even though total wealth continues to grow in the United States, it has not been shared nearly as much. There's a lot more wealth disparity. The wealth is only going to a small percentage of the population. The rest of the United States has been in relative decline since that time, and this is reflected in the percentage of people moving. People move much more when they're young. So this chart represents the movement of people based on age groups. Now, when you're small children, or even up to the age of 14 or 15, you really have no choice. You go where your parents go. But as you get older, what happens is young people tend to move a lot more than older people. There is one big exception, though. If you look at the ages here, you have this dip that happens in around 10 to 14, 15 to 17 years old, and then goes back up again. People begin to move again. What tends to happen is that people with young children move a lot more than people with, like, say, tweens or preteens and teenagers, because once kids are in school, there's this general tendency not to want to disrupt them and move them out of schools. So it slows down moving a little bit, but then it picks up again. And when you get to about the mid-30s, then there starts to be a decline in the amount of movement people will do, with a little bit of an uptick after retirement here, going to rest homes and changing states. Generally speaking, people in their 30s, late 20s and 30s tend to move the most. What we also see here that there is movement within the same county is much greater than the same state, meaning that people tend to move closer. So most moves are happening locally. You can see here the same trend, though, that there is an overall decline in migration rate going on. We want to get at why people move. And again, if you just look at the numbers, time stamp A versus time stamp B, who's living where at those points in time, you can do the math. figure out the migration rates and all that, but we want to know a lot more than that. We want to figure out the reasons, the social, personal, economic, political reasons why people move. That takes a lot more work, and it takes a lot of qualitative research to get at that. But here's a quick chart from a moving company who queries its customers and what it has found as to why people move. Now, how much credence do we want to give this? A certain amount. I mean, it is interesting data, but we certainly would want to back this up with more academic studies. And you can see that people are looking for a new, nicer home, better neighborhoods, want to establish households, and then there are many other reasons, work-related reasons. Some of it's natural disasters, family reasons, and so on. So let's just quantify that a little bit. What we've been finding from a more research-oriented perspective is people are moving for family reasons and housing, and not as much as you would think for employment. And then others could be amenities, disasters, you name it, right? Any other reasons why people might want to move. So here we are, according to a U.S. government survey, here are the numbers that we see. There are some regional differences, but they're not extreme. You can look by these numbers and you can check this out on your own. I'll post these notes as usual. An earlier researcher, Ernest Ravenstein, created what he called the laws of migrations. Basically, these are just generalization that he outlined in terms of why people move. Found that every time you have a migration flow phenomena, it typically tends to generate a return or a counter migration. For example, in the United States, when we had a huge influx of immigrants from Europe in the late 19th century to the early 20th century, a significant portion of those people actually returned to Europe. There was also a case where they would come back and forth, so it wasn't just a one-way movement. And again, the majority of migrants do move as short distances. Migrants who move longer distances tend to choose big city destinations. At least that's what he found at the time. Urban residents are often less migratory than inhabitants of rural areas. So once you're in a city, you tend to stay put a little bit more. And families are less likely to make international moves than young adults are. He found that most migrants are adults. In general, large towns, cities, grow by migration rather than natural increase because city life tends to produce a much lower fertility rate. So the growth that happens is because people are moving into the city versus natural growth. And migration happens stage by stage. What he's suggesting here is that there is a model, which we'll take a look at later, that looks at how people move. Basically, the stages represent from the most rural to the most urban. So people tend to move from highly rural to less rural to somewhat urban, then to most urban. Once you have these movements, you start to see big differences within rural and urban migrations. The other thing he points out is that technology facilitates migration, like transportation technology and communication technology, to learning about places and wanting to move there. And then, of course, the last one is that economic conditions spur migration. So places that have many more job opportunities tend to bring people in. If you look at, I think this is Guatemala, what you see here is we're seeing this classic migration from little tiny towns, hamlets, to larger towns, and then ultimately into the capital city. You're seeing this inflow happening. This has been pretty steady over the last several decades. Once you have a more established, sort of first world economically advanced situation like this, then you start to have a different kind of flow where you start to see an outflow, not just people coming into the cities, as you see in developing areas of the world, but also an outflow to the suburbs and in some cases even back to rural areas. Everett Lee identified pull and push factors that encourage people to move. The push factors tend to be the negative stuff, that they leave because they can't find a job, there's few opportunities, bad conditions, climate issues, environmental problems. Sometimes it's about political fear or persecution. It can be about all kinds of negative influences in human life and human flourishing. On a personal level, it could be from just death threats, bullying, fleeing an abusive boyfriend or girlfriend, or whatever it might be. Typically, it's just things that force people to move. So a lot of times moving is involuntarily. People don't necessarily want to move, but they have to move. They feel like they have to move for their own safety and benefit. Of course, war is a big one as well. And then there are pull factors. These are generally positive things that attract people to come to new places. Better living conditions, having more freedom, job opportunities, educational opportunities, more security. Sometimes it's family links, just being closer to family, all kinds of reasons. Better climate, more amenities. So they come hand in hand because where you have a push factor, let's say with lack of unemployment of work, then there are places that have work. You're going to have push factors and then getting people to want to leave an area, and then they're going to go to the places that have the pull factors that have the more jobs. Same thing with services, security, from a dangerous place to a safe place, high crime to low crime, from droughts to better conditions, and so on. And this all does make sense. So one thing that's hard to figure out is when we're trying to assess migration, how do these pull and push factors work together? How many people are actually moving because they want to move versus what they're feeling forced to move? And how many are sort of in between? Now, people have developed a demographic transition model as we studied, and you can throw migration into this model now. So we added epidemiological issues to this demographic model. Now we're adding migration. So in the stage one, you tend to have most basic conditions, low growth rate because you have both high births and high deaths. And so there's seasonal mobility. And there's also ritualistic mobility as well. There's like nomadic people and so on. So very, very common mobility, in fact, on a daily basis, often. In stage two, we start to get much higher natural rates of increase because of declining death rates. You start to get international immigration, and you start to get interregional migration starting to happen. So people are leaving, going between countries, and they're starting to move into the cities in a big way. In stage three, where your natural increase is declining because now births are also declining along with death, you tend to have high international immigration where people are moving from country to country. And a continued interregional migrations, but this time sometimes it reverses a little bit and people are moving from the cities back into the suburban areas, which is still urban, but just less urban, not necessarily back to rural areas. And then stage four is the same as stage three, although sometimes here you also have a combination where people are moving back to more rural areas as well. Here's what it looks like in chart form. So in stage one, you have this kind of subsistence economies. People move very little, usually only locally and daily, or ritualistically in terms of like where the food sources are, where they're not hunting, that kind of thing. Also, when you get into early farming, you might have local economies, like subsistence economies, or people trading village to village. And then stage two, you have migrations happening to other countries here in this purple. And as you move out of the pre-industrial area into the industrial area, you start to see the shift in stage three, where you start to see migration begin to slow down in some cases. In stage three, you see a lot more overseas immigration, people leaving from one continent to another, as happened in the United States, Europeans coming over. Where we started to enter our stage three in the early 20th century was a time of high immigration. And then stage four, you start to get declining immigration from the cities, and even a reversal where you start to get people leaving the cities and going back to suburbs, and also in particular, sometimes actually leaving cities altogether. And now with the advent of remote work, this has really been accelerating because people can go and live in rural areas and still make wages that are comparable to what you would make in the city. Now there are macroeconomic theories of migration. So macroeconomic means the big picture of the economy, the big systemic sort of aggregate picture. So you're looking at things like gross domestic product, wages, averages, and that kind of thing. And what we see here is that people will say, theoretically, that migration is being pushed or fueled by wage differentials. So from one place that has high wages to another that has low wages, and you start to see the flow happening, like almost like electricity going from positive to negative. You see just a general flow that occurs when you have this imbalance, and it tries to regulate the imbalance, and eventually enough people move to the area of high wages that it brings the wages down, and enough people leave the areas of low wages that it brings the wages up, and it begins to balance out. Of course, this doesn't always happen. In fact, it doesn't happen quite often. So this basic economic theory doesn't really meet the observed data that we see in the world very well. Now, it doesn't mean it's not real. It is an actual force. It actually does spur migration, but there are many, many other factors involved as well that mitigate this theory. There is an assumption that labor will move to respond to imbalance, but unfortunately, we have things like national borders, which people can cross. So, like in the globalization era, we've been able to have a world where corporations can cross and move from country to country and set up jobs and industries and so forth, but workers can't. They have to go through the migration process, which is very slow and cumbersome, and there are many, many restrictions to it. This macroeconomic theory then is stifled by that. Also, the other thing is people are not always rational being with full information. They may not know that there are better jobs in other places, or they may think there are, but there really aren't. Right? They may be misinformed. People will move based on erroneous data or erroneous assumptions. And so that tends to promote an imbalance continuation. And so we see persistent regional disparities remaining despite this theory. There are also many personal factors. Again, why people move is far beyond just economics. We have to measure that. We have to understand that. And it's challenging to do so. There are also now many, many environmental factors that are really coming into play. They've always been there, but they're because of climate change. There's augmented reasons for moving because of climate reasons. And then there's always just people moving for basic amenities. I want to live closer to Disney World. I want to live by the ocean. In some cases too, we're starting to see as we're getting more polarized that people may want to move from an area because they just feel out of place there politically or culturally and want to move to someplace else. There are also micro behavioral approaches. So instead of macroeconomics, microeconomics that are associated with why the reasons people move more psychologically. People not necessarily making a rational decision, but what's called satisficing, or a combination of satisfy and suffice. So good enough decision making. They may not have all the facts, they may have it even wrong, but they think there's enough reason for what they know that it's good enough to move. And this is why a lot of people sometimes move, not because it makes full rational sense, but because based on what they know, they think it does. And it may or may not make sense. And how do we get to that? How do we understand why people are making these decisions? We can't look at the macro statistics and look at job wages and that. What we have to do is we have to query the people. We have to talk to the people. That requires qualitative research methods to do that. We have to do things like participant observation and longitudinal studies and look at personal histories and interviews and surveys and that kind of thing. Another sort of theoretical model is what's called human capital theory. This presupposes that humans make a cost-benefit analysis. They look at the good things about moving, the bad things about moving, weigh them out, and decide that if the benefits exceeds the cost, they will move. And it's not just about wages, it's about everything. Being closer to your family, better educational opportunities, better amenities, safer environment, those kinds of questions are all factored into this cost benefit analysis. The critique is the same really because again, humans are not fully rational beings. We are emotional and we have limited information. We don't always have access to full information, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. People are not acting on good data. And so the ability to accurately estimate what's good enough is questionable. There's a job search model of migration that people move in the hope of finding the right job. Now, sometimes what happens is you move before you get a job. You think, okay, I'm going to go live in Seattle. There's lots of jobs in Seattle, so I'm just going to quit my job, and just go there and live with a friend and find one. Or sometimes what happens is that people will take temporary work. Say, okay, I can take this 6 months gig out in Seattle, and maybe after that, in the meantime, I will look for a job. So people will sort of base their job searches as a reason to move rather than focusing in on potential of like wages and benefits and that kind of thing. It's just, okay, I have this opportunity or I want to move, and so I'm going to take the risk. Another one is residential mobility. And so here we have what's called a life cycle theory. I earlier showed you a chart how people move greater or lesser extent depending on their ages. So it's related to that. Changes in life foster reasons to move. Graduating school, getting married, having a family, changing health, retirement, all of these things is what precipitates people moving. Now, the critiques to this is that sometimes people don't move because they have rational decisions or choice. Sometimes people move because they have to. And in fact, the percentage of people who move because they have to versus they want to is actually quite high. We don't know exactly what it is, but somewhere in the neighborhood of about 25% in the United States and much greater in other places. There are many, many cultural and economic constraints to people moving. Sometimes people want to move and they can't move. That's the other side of the coin, right? You might think you want to move, but you don't feel like it's worth the risk. The other thing that is happening is that our traditional nuclear family is being challenged culturally in many ways these days. This has been happening for decades, but it's really accelerating as well. You have many, many types of families now. You have single parent families, you have empty nesters, you have families that don't have families, they don't have children anyway, they just have partners. You have alternative lifestyles, polyamorous for lifestyles, all kinds of things are happening. But you have people moving in with friends, and there's nothing romantic about it, but they share the costs more and more so. You have a lot more people staying with their parents a lot longer. It was not common in the United States 30 years ago for a 25-year-old to still be living with their parents. Today, it's a lot more common, and a lot more accepted, in fact. Again, it goes back to this chart I showed you earlier, that migration and age are very much related. There is this peak in the late 20s, early 30s, where people really are moving quite a bit, and then it slows down, tapers down from there until about retirement age and goes up a little bit. With this one exception of young couples with young children moving more than couples with older children in school. That's what's causing this weird decline here. There's also income. So people with means that have more money and wealth tend to move a lot more because they can. They're able to. And they're also connected. They're better networked. It's easy for them to get jobs elsewhere. They are typically more educated and have access to resources that poor people do not. But you get to a certain level, then it begins to taper off and go down, where people with much higher income begin to move a little bit less. Probably they're more satisfied with where they are. You also have some differences with gender. Typically, men migrate more than women historically. As you can see by this chart here, the blue line represents total emigration. And you can see over time, as we get into the modern age, we get more and more emigration across the world. Much, much more. Women that moved hovered around 35%, up and down a bit. This largely has to do with global effects of war, that kind of thing. But typically it was around 35%. It started to go up a little bit in the early 20th century. What we're seeing today is that it's been going up and up and up, and now we're up to around 50%. The standardized accounts for age differences between men and women, so it balances that a little bit. Either line is showing the same pattern, where you start to see more and more people who are migrants are females. It used to be traditionally that men would migrate, and then they eventually would bring their families. That's no longer the case anymore. Families tend to move together, and there's also a significant phenomena of women just moving as well. For example, there's a lot of places where there is a lot of domestic service workers, they're mostly women, will move to for those reasons. The other phenomena that we see is typically what happens is you have an immigrant or a very small group arrives in a particular locale, and then they encourage their families to come. Once there is a large group there, that also creates a community, and that community encourages more people to come. And then this new community then begins to really draw in a lot more people, and you start to get this cycle that reinforces itself. So more and more people will come in. All of a sudden, you have a large community group. But this has represented what's been happening in the United States quite well since the, let's say, late 19th century, and even earlier than that. The other big event, of course, is climate change. And climate change now is destabilizing the planet environmentally. You take an example of a place like Bangladesh here, and you see that these areas in dark green are very low-lying areas, prone to flooding, especially if you get a typhoon coming up the coast, which does happen here. It can create exceedingly serious flooding in these areas, and then sea level rise just adds to that. But you also see on this map on the right that there are high populations of 1,000 people per square miles or more in these light green here across this whole area, which coincides to some extent with the low-lying areas. So what essentially is happening here is that more and more people are having to move either within this country or outside the country. And as climate change accelerates, we're talking about, in this particular one country, there's about 150 million people that live in flood-prone areas that will probably have to relocate if the predictions about sea level rise are correct. All kinds of things affect migration, and they're usually compounded with each other, and they support each other, or they augment each other. For example, climate change and the pandemic in the United States. What happened with the pandemic is a lot of people began to do remote work and move out into different areas. A significant percentage of people have moved back into rural areas, which means they've moved back to areas that are much more prone to climate risk, like flooding and drought. And this is what these maps represent. You start to see here, here's the beginning of the pandemic, right here at 2020, and you see the rise of people migrating to risk areas. This is in the case of drought on the top here, and the bottom one is in the case of forest fires and wildfires. These things are interlinked, and that's one of the things I want you to get out of this class is that there is an interrelationship in populations. To understand what's happening in terms of demographics and population geography, we have to look at other factors as well. We have to look at economics and politics and environment and climate, and they're all interrelated, and they all work together to create these phenomena. To an even greater extent, we start to see that climate and conflict also affect population dynamics quite a bit. Drought is leading to instability and water weaponization in the Middle East and North Africa. This has been happening now for a while. It's really affecting, in particular, areas that are already prone to extreme drought and water scarcity. These are the areas that are feeling it first. Even the Pentagon has put out studies that show that the augment in destabilization in the Middle East is associated with scarcity, resource scarcity, water scarcity, food scarcity, which is being made worse by climate change. So this is something we're going to have to deal with. We start to see these cycles forming, right, where conflicts affect people and make the situations there even worse. So you might have a drought that leads to a conflict. The conflict augments the misery in that area, making people want to leave even more. These creates these cycles that can really all of a sudden spur massive migration. In the worst cases where you have all-out war like you had in Syria or in Gaza right now, you start to see these mass movements of refugees that all of a sudden just explode into the scene. And you have millions and millions of people that are now homeless all at once. All of this, again, works together to create these issues that we're struggling with in the world. I hope that made sense to you. Please let me know if you have any questions. I will look forward to getting your assignments. Thank you.